Welcome back to Viewpoint. I'm Jim Zogby. My next guest is Rick Nelson. He is Director of the Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Program and Senior Fellow in International Security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Former Navy helicopter pilot with over 20 years operational and intelligence experience, including assignments at the National Security Council, the National Counterterrorism Center, and recently served in Afghanistan. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Jim.
I want to talk about Afghanistan. There have been some tragic events over the last month or so. First, there was this Quran burning, and then the violence that followed that with several Americans losing their lives, and continued unrest over a long period of time. And that was followed now by this killing of 16 Afghan civilians by, it appears, a single American soldier. I want to look at each of these and talk about the consequences. First, with the Quran burning, what do we know about it? How did something like that, I mean, the first thing that occurred to me when I heard it was, after all this time, didn't anybody think about it? How could something like that happen? What do we know about it?
I think that's a very accurate assessment, of how the Afghan people and certainly the government viewed it. Is after 10 years in Afghanistan of trying to understand our culture, we now have a situation where soldiers who are supposed to be versed in our culture are actually burning the Qurans, and from their perspective, demonstrated a lack of understanding of what that meant to them. And so I think what actually happened, the details is that we had basically an administrative oversight of some individuals not understanding how to appropriately handle the materials and what was to be done with them, and it was just a bureaucratic snafu is what it comes down to.
With terrible consequences.
Absolutely. People are getting killed. Those are absolutely terrible consequences.
The military command apologized. The president apologized. Some here in the U.S. criticized the president rather vigorously for it. Kind of a no-win situation here. But do the apologies matter there?
Well, I think they do matter, and I think that we see that with the recent the massacre that happened in Kandahar, where the apologies, I think, were very effective. Again, the question wasn't so much that the magnitude of the apologies was just a failure from their Afghans' perspective for us to understand the issue. So the apology only goes so far in that particular instance.
Well, going now to the civilian killings. What do we know about it? What do we know about what caused this situation? Not what caused it, but what it appears a single person, no one else involved. How did it happen? What do we know?
I mean, what we know, what we've seen in the media is, a soldier left his base of operations. He was armed, as most soldiers are in Afghanistan. That's a combat zone, and then went about on basically, it's been described as a killing spree and killing women and children. A very tragic event. It's very difficult to describe what would motivate him to do that or what happened. There's been some speculation that maybe multiple tours in Iraq, maybe it had some traumatic impact on him, and something like trauma, affects each and every soldier differently. So it's very difficult to make any sort of, broad sweeping assertion as to what motivated him, but it's a tragic event.
Now, I want to talk about that part of it because that's something that bothers me, having gone through Vietnam and then the aftermath of Vietnam, where so many of our homeless were Vietnam vets. And we're now seeing, my office is in the same building as the one of the veteran service agencies here in Washington, and they've been telling me that the new homeless are now Iraqi and Afghan veterans. Who would have thought that 10 years ago, 11 years ago after 9/11, that we'd be fighting a decade-long war and having just finished a 7-year war in Iraq with a small army, where we end up with individuals who have 3 rotations in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, obviously taking a huge toll. And we will be seeing the consequences of this in the years to come. I mean, is the military aware of the dangers there and also the dangers here of what happens to these guys after all these tours and all this trauma? Whether or not a single event occurs that creates a bigger trauma, but the trauma of just being at war for this long. This is a huge burden for these young men and women to bear. What do we do about that?
It's a very good point. I think that we've been kind of we're going to see almost a victim of our success in some of the advances we've had in battlefield medicine, where individuals who normally would have died in combat are now surviving. And I don't think that we as a society, I think the military actually understands this and is trying to get their arms around this. I'm not sure we as a society understand the long-term impact that having a lot of individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder or a traumatic brain injury are going to have on us.
Which apparently was the case with this individual after, in his third tour in Iraq, he had a traumatic brain injury. They sent him back out.
And we're trying to understand. There's been a lot of reports and a lot of studies, and I know the Department of Defense has been invested a lot of money in trying to determine and assess what the impact of this is going to be. But this is going to be something that's going to be with us for a generation, and it's going to require us to stay very vigilant to take care of these veterans, who many have served multiple tours in either Iraq and or Afghanistan.
So we're aware of the problem, and to your knowledge, it does have a counterterrorism. It has a national security component here at home. The violence there becomes violence here. I mean, we saw that with militias that grew up in the 70s and 80s that housed many of these characters. I mean, one could argue that Al-Qaeda, in its origins, was a whole group of young Arabs who were suffering post-traumatic shock syndrome from all of their time on the battlefield against the Russians. And yet we've got this situation here. I'm not saying that these individuals are going to be violence prone, but they are they're hurt individuals. And we just saw one of them play out in that way. They're aware of it. Is there a program to deal with it to this day?
There are programs to deal with it. And again, I think that the Pentagon has been very aggressive in trying to wrap its arms around the impact of this. But again, it's kind of a learn-as-you-go type evolution, because we haven't really investigated this. But we're an all-volunteer military, and we have an obligation to take care of our veterans. And right now, we have a lot of organizations that are raising money to help these individuals. The Department of Defense is allocating resources. Congress is authorizing resources. And I'm not so much concerned about the near term. I'm concerned about the long term. 20 or 30 or 40 years from now, are we going to remember our Iraq and our Afghan vets and what they're going through? And it's going to be important for us as a society to do that.
While I'm on this, before I get back to Afghanistan itself, I remember the press conference that the president had a short while ago after the Netanyahu visit, and the calls of some of his opponents to bomb Iran and be more aggressive there. And he gave a very poignant little discourse on, let's not be so free and easy about sending our young men and women into yet another combat situation. The commander-in-chief has to be sensitive to these issues in a way that candidates don't.
That's exactly right. Again, we are blessed in many ways with a cadre of young men and women that are willing to volunteer on a regular basis. The military is meeting the recruiting goals for the most part, to put their lives on the line, to serve multiple tours in combat zones, and we have to respect that, and we have to treat that appropriately.
We did a poll in November in Afghanistan and here in the United States. The U.S. is disliked substantially across the board in Afghanistan. Karzai is disliked substantially across the board. The Taliban were in ascent. I mean, people were speaking very favorably about them. I said at the time, when I looked at the results, I said, this is a writing on the wall. It's a warning sign that in effect people are hedging their bets. They're figuring this is the drift, this is the way it's going, and not so much I like these guys and don't like those guys, but these are the guys who are going to come out on top. Can trust be rebuilt before we depart, or is this basically going to revert to the Taliban?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question, Jim, but I think that, trust has already exists. So we have to be careful when we say rebuilt. Certainly we've lost some areas of trust, but these instances, as terrible as they are, shouldn't undermine all the successes that we have had in Afghanistan and the partnerships that we have developed. We need to get past the rhetoric and remind everyone involved that we've invested, hundreds of billions of dollars into this conflict. We've been there for 10 years. There's a lot of good that has come out of this, and that good is going to continue to exist inside Afghanistan.
Well, I wonder where this goes. I mean, President Karzai wants us now out of rural areas. That's going to seriously impact the ability of the U.S. to succeed with this surge. The Taliban have now broken off negotiations. And even the U.S. is saying that a more rapid pullout is going to occur. Is this a salvageable mission?
Well, the mission, the original mission, was to go after Al-Qaeda. It was to get the perpetrators of 9/11, bin Laden, Zawahiri. It was to drive Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan and defeat the Al-Qaeda presence in the region. We've accomplished most of those goals in the area. So we've been very successful regarding the mission. Now we're in more of this, counterinsurgency where we're trying to preserve the Afghan government and create a nation that's stable and secure. So we've accomplished our mission in many ways, but we just can't walk away from Afghanistan wholly without ensuring there's a smooth transition.
Is there a danger of that, though, with Newt Gingrich now even joining the call to get out and other Republicans sort of hedging their bets? In the last poll that was done, I think an ABC News one, 60% of Americans say this wasn't worth it, and only 23% of Democrats and independents saying it was worth it. Republicans, the only one actually leaning over toward a split half and half. I mean, the American people are turning against it. Is it sustainable if, in fact, you've got people saying, why are we there?
Well, it's not going to be sustained. I mean, we're going to have our combat troops out of there by 2014, and we're going to turn it, the security over to the Afghan National Security Forces. At the end of the day, we are in that country because the Afghan government, the Afghan people, for the most part, want us there, and that's our goal. But our ultimate goal is to turn it back over to them so they can provide their own security. We have a drawdown plan in place that the president is committed to, and I think we need to stick to that. It's happening very quickly. I don't know if you can accelerate it much more than it already is going to occur.
But events like the ones that just occurred impede even the ability to carry out that phased plan. With regard to the Afghan people, the polling numbers say otherwise. They point in a different direction. And now, with the Afghan people saying no, and Americans increasingly saying no, it becomes difficult to imagine how you get to 2013, not to speak of 2014, which was the ultimate date of withdrawal. I'm going to share your concern about an abrupt withdrawal and what happens. I mean, we saw that when the Russians left and what happened. But the question is, how do we not avert that outcome when everything is playing right now against it? And I will add, and the Taliban walk out of the talks, which were the one chance to kind of create some modus vivendi between them and the Karzai government.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Taliban walking out of the talks that are, reportedly happening is kind of a bit of a red herring. I mean, they're going to use this opportunity to exploit this to their advantage. So I think it's more rhetoric than anything else. Preserving it. Again, we're going to have to hope that we can, enhance the relationship and get past these tragic events and make sure that the drawdown is in the best interest of both nations. Karzai can use all the rhetoric he wants, but at the end of the day, he's tied to the presence of the U.S. He needs the U.S. in the country to ensure his stability and stability of the government. So I don't give put a lot behind the rhetoric that he says about pulling the troops out of the villages and back into the bases, because at the end of the day, he needs the U.S. troops at least for the next couple of years to get his security forces to the appropriate level. So
other than training, other than counterinsurgency, which is apparently now what the president said we'll move toward and away from an more active combat role, and other than that and creating some negotiated settlement with the combatants, the folks we're fighting with, that's about where we are?
Well, it is. I mean, I've always looked at Afghanistan through the Pakistan prism. And I want to bring up the issue of Pakistan. One of our advantages for us being in Afghanistan is to be ready to react to any militant activity that comes out of Pakistan or Western Federally Administered Tribal areas specifically, until we ensure that threat is completely wiped out. So I see it's advantageous for the United States to stay in Afghanistan, to provide the security force assistance to the troops inside Afghanistan so they can provide for the security for themselves against the Taliban, but also for the United States to ensure that the Al-Qaeda threat does eventually, be diminished to the point that it's no longer threatening inside our borders back here.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jim, for having me on.
It's a troubled situation that apparently is going to get a little more troubled before it gets better.
It is. It is.
Thanks for joining us. That's all the time we've got for now. I just want to tell you one more time, if you want more information on the polling we did in Afghanistan and American attitudes towards it, as well as Afghani attitudes towards America, and if you want information on our polling on Syria and how the region is viewing that regime and the outcome of the conflict there, log on to our website, aaiusa.org. You can follow us on Twitter, aaiusa. Thanks for joining us. I'll see you next time on Viewpoint. Thanks.